Assalamu alaikum everyone.
Okay, فصل اعلم أن الأذكار المشروعة في الصلاة وغيرها واجبة كانت أو مستحبة لا يحسب شيء منها ولا يعتد به حتى يتلفظ به بحيث يسمع نفسه إذا كان صحيح السمع لا عرض له. So we're continuing, and this is the last part of the introduction of Imam Nawawi. And this last section before he starts the actual his first bab, which is the first full chapter in the Kitab Adhkar, is he talks about, he says, know that those Adhkar, mean types of litanies, anything that is recited as the dhikr, that are mashru'ah. Mashru'ah means that have a precedent in the Quran or the Sunnah. Yeah, so specific formulations that have a precedent in the Quran or in the Sunnah. He said, whether that be fi salah, whether you are reciting them in the prayer, wa ghayriha, or outside of the prayer. Yeah. In other words, in order to say that you've recited a litany, what's the definition of recitation? To say what's the lafz? The lafz in Arabic means a word, anything that's linguistically means anything that's spat out. Yeah, ma yatalaffadhu bihi al-insan is anything that a person articulates or says. So what's the definition of articulation? What's the difference between thinking about doing dhikr and actually doing dhikr? Yeah. And in the previous lesson, I have said that actually thinking about dhikr is a form of dhikr, because dhikr is a more general term, and the more specific term within it is the word dhukr, which means to remember God with your heart. So when we say dhikr of Allah, what we're saying is to remember God with both the tongue and internally, meaning to internalize it, to do it with your heart. So here what he's talking about is, at what point can you say that you're not only remembering God with your heart, but also with your tongue? He says that in order for it to be considered a actual recitation of dhikr, he said it has to be recited in such a way that you can at the very least hear yourself. Okay, so that the same applies in the salah when you're reading any of your recitations. So when you're reading, when you're standing and you're reading the Fatiha and you're reading the surah, for example, or when you're in sujood and you're reading the tasbih, for all of these, you need to be able to recite it such that you, in perfect conditions, would be able to hear yourself. In other words, you actually are reciting. Now, that's not to say you have to say it loud, or that you have to be able to say it in such a way that it could be a whisper. Yeah. And it could be such a whisper that nobody around you can hear. So you don't have to whisper in such a way that everybody around you can hear you, or somebody next to you can hear you. This is about, just imagine you are in a room where there is dead silence. Yeah, dead silence, just you reading. What's the lowest you can make your voice? Yeah. What's the lowest you can make your voice such that you'll just about be able to hear yourself? And that would be pretty low. So actually what everyone does in their prayer is what's going to, that'll be more than, I'm sure that'll be more than fine. So he's just making this distinction here that when we say dhikr, articulation, just to be clear, that articulation means actually articulation of the tongue and actually generating some sort of sound. It's also relevant specifically for sisters who are, let's say, menstruating, or they have discharge following childbirth. The ruling is that they're not allowed to recite Quran. The same definition applies. Yeah, so recitation would mean articulation. So as long as they're not articulating and they're reading, full words, combining words. So single words at a time are fine, but when you start combining them, you start forming ayat, that's when it becomes a problem. And the ruling is that it has to, as long as it does not meet the definition of articulation, then that's okay. فصل اعلم أنه قد صنف في عمل اليوم والليلة جماعة من الأئمة كتبا نفيسة رووا فيها ما ذكروه بأسانيدهم المتصلة. He says much has been written by way of books of Adhkar. And amalul yawm wal layla means, recommended du'as and things like that to read during the day and during the night, meaning at any point in the day. So he says many books have been written on this. وطرقوها من طرق كثيرة ومن أحسنها عمل اليوم والليلة للإمام أبي عبد الرحمن النسائي And the Sheikh then goes on to say one of the best books in his time that he came across was a book written by Abu Abdurrahman al-Nasa'i. And he says, and he said, وأكثر فوائد كتب أمل يوم والليلة لصاحبه الإمام أبي بكر أحمد بن محمد بن إسحاق السني رضي الله عنهم وقد سمعت أنا جميع كتاب ابن السني على شيخنا الإمام الحافظ أبي البقاء خالد بن يوسف. And he also goes on to say, he said, the other book that he thinks is even better than that text that he himself has recited to his sheikh, was a book written by Ibn Sunni. And he says he recited the whole text to his sheikh, and out of respect and reverence for his sheikh, and also just to start off his book in the best of footings, this is part of the sunnah of the ulama. So what he does is that he mentions the full sanad then of the text that he considers to be the best text in this field of Adhkar. He mentions the full text, the full sanad of who he heard it from and who the book was by. He references, so this is another example of a hadith scholar referencing. And actually, the idea of referencing people is found in the Muslim works, because some of the earliest books were written on this. Imam al-Suyuti radiallahu an, he wrote an entire risala, a kind of epistle on the topic of theft of books. And he called, and what he meant by that is copyright theft, right? It's where somebody writes a book, and rather than acknowledging that it was written by somebody else, you just kind of pass it off as your own. So the idea of referencing and being intellectually honest about where you took your benefit from is found amongst people like Suyuti, but even earlier than that, people like Imam Khatib al-Baghdadi radiallahu anh spoke about it. Some of the historians speak about this topic of, they say, sariqa, which is if you benefit from somebody's book and you don't reference from them, it's akin to theft. They called it theft. So here the Sheikh does that, but also, and the reason why we do it is not just to recognize somebody else's, it's not about someone getting intellectual kudos. That wasn't the reason why they did it. They did it because when someone makes dua, you want them to make dua for the person that this came from. So they want to be mentioned, because by mentioning their name, inshallah, that you've made that intention for them, and therefore they get benefit from it. So they want to be remembered so that people remember and make dua for them. That was the reason behind why people wanted to be remembered, not necessarily because they wanted some sort of intellectual, people to give them a pat on the back. I really don't believe that was the reason why they did it. And here's a good example of that, because Imam al-Nawawi radiallahu anh then proceeds to give the entire sanad of, he says, I won't read all of the sanad, it's here. He says, ala shaykhina al-Imam al-Hafiz. In fact, I'll read it. It's not very long, just because the Sheikh has made a point of putting it in here, so it's only right that we recognize them. Al-Imam al-Hafiz said, I read this book, the entire book, upon my Sheikh Al-Imam al-Hafiz al-Baqa, Abu al-Baqa Khalid ibn Yusuf ibn Sa'ad ibn al-Hasan radiyallahu anhu, قال أخبرنا الإمام العلامة أبو اليمن زيد ibn Hasan ibn Zayd ibn Hussein al-Kindi سنة 62 و600 قال أخبرنا الشيخ الإمام أبو الحسن سعد الخير محمد بن سهل الأنصاري قال أخبرنا الشيخ الإمام أبو محمد عبد الرحمن بن سعد بن أحمد بن حسن الدوني قال أخبرنا القاضي أبو النصر أحمد بن الحسين بن محمد بن الكسار الدينوري قال أخبرنا الشيخ أبو بكر أحمد بن محمد بن إسحاق السني رضي الله عنه وإنما, and then so he goes all the way back to Ibn Sunni. So وإنما ذكرت هذا الإسناد هنا لأني سأنقل من كتاب ابن السني إن شاء الله تعالى جملا. And here's the reference. He says, the reason why I gave you the entire sanad of this book is, he says, because inshallah, I intend to mention some of the passages, reference some of the passages from that text. And he said, فأحببت, and he said, I desired to تقديم إسناد الكتاب. He said, to at the very onset, at the beginning of this book, to mention the sanad, which is the people that he took this, the person that the sheikh that he took the book from, all the way back to the author of this text, Amalul Yawm wal Layla. وإنما ذكرت هذا الإسناد هنا لأني سأنقل من كتاب ابن السني إن شاء الله تعالى جملا فأحببت تقديم إسناد الكتاب وهذا مستحسن عند أئمة الحديث وغيرهم. And he said, this is something that is mustahsan means a good practice of the people of hadith and also other people of, meaning other scholars. وإنما خصصت ذكر إسناد هذا الكتاب لكونه أجمع الكتب في هذا الفن. And he said, I chose to mention this particular book because it's seen as the most comprehensive work on this in this field. So the barakah for the sheikh is that if you make reference to the most well-respected, well-known, and most comprehensive text in the Adhkar, and you then write a book yourself on it, because remember, Imam Nawawi told us why he wrote this book. It's not because he thought there was a gap, that these Adhkar have not been found anywhere else. He did it because he thought a lot of the books that have been written on this topic are very detailed, very expansive, and actually they are inaccessible for the layperson who just wants to get to the Adhkar. They don't want to listen to, or sorry, read 15 pages of commentary and the 15-20 asanid on which are the chains of narrations for each hadith they read. They just want to get to the hadith and benefit from it. So he wrote the Kitab al-Adhkar to meet that need. وإلا فجميع ما أذكره فيه لي به روايات صحيحة بسماعات متصلة بحمد الله تعالى إلا الشاذ النادر. And the Sheikh says, look, everything that I've read and what you'll find in these books is, he says, is all well known. These are sound narrations. They are all muttasil. Muttasil in the science of hadith means that they are all connected hadith. There's no narration that he mentions which has a gap in the chain. Yeah. So say, for example, if I was to narrate something from, if I was to tell you about something I'd heard about person X, and I haven't heard it directly from person X, then you might want to know who I heard it from. So I'd say I heard it from person Y, and you'd say, well, did person Y hear it from person X? And I might say no. And if the answer is no, then you'd say, well, who did person Y hear it from? So eventually you need to know that there is an unbroken chain that goes back to person X. If anybody is missing in that chain, then the whole kind of chain, the chain is only as strong as its weakest link, which means you can have an amazing, detailed kind of account of what happened, but if ultimately it goes back to somebody who can't then credibly explain how he witnessed it, then it becomes, it's no longer reliable. So therefore, having a muttasil chain was very important. Having a chain that isn't munqati, doesn't have qata in it, which means it's not broken in any way. And the science of hadith, this has a specific terminology that we use, and those of you who are familiar with it will already be familiar. But just for the interest of those people who are not familiar with this terminology. He says, well, here's Sahihan, and then he tells us the books that he's benefited from, the 5 main books which we've previously spoken about. He kind of reiterates it here, and he says that I also benefited from the Muwatta Imam Malik and the Musnad Imam Ahmad every now and again, Abu Awana, Ibn Majah, Darqutni, Bayhaqi, وغيرهما ومن أجزاء مما ستراه إن شاء الله. And then also he took some narrations from specific texts which are very so hadith books that have they're not there are certain hadith works which are quite comprehensive in the types of chapters they cover, and there are some that are very specific to one particular field, one particular area. And so these are there are words like that we use again in hadith. These are called ajza. Sometimes these are specific to a particular narrator or a particular sheikh. فصل اعلم أن ما أذكره في هذا الكتاب من الأحاديث أضيفه إلى الكتب المشهورة وغيرهما مما قدمته، ثم ما كان في صحيح البخاري ومسلم أو في أحدهما أقتصر على إضافته إليهما لحصول الغرض وهو صحته. He then again reiterates that he says anything that I've narrated from one of the well-known hadith books, he said I simply just mention its sound. He said I'm not going to go into the particulars of the narration. He said لحصول الغرض, because it meets my objective. Everyone knows if it's in Sahih Bukhari you can rely on it. Same with if it's in Sahih Muslim. He said because all of these are sound hadith. He said إن كان فيه ضعف في غالب المواضع. So he says إلى كتب السنة. He said, but sometimes he said as for that which is other than Sahih Bukhari and Sahih Muslim, He said, then I again attributed them to the appropriate work. So if it's in Sahih Sunan Abu Dawood, then he mentions Sunan Abu Dawood. And he said, I again clarify whether it's sound, whether it's acceptable, whether it's weak. He said, and he said, yeah, he said, sometimes look, there are certain narrations that he mentioned that do have weakness in them. And he said, and there may be some instances, and this is his, this is him being humble now. He says, there are some instances where I'm not certain whether it's sound or not. Yeah, so he tells us that, look, just be aware, there will be instances where there are, and there are examples of this in the text, to be fair, which when we get to them, inshallah, if it's appropriate, we'll touch on them. وقد رأيت أن أقدم في أول الكتاب بابا في فضيلة الذكر. And he said, I thought it appropriate that at the beginning of this text, so now he's telling us about the first chapter, because we're about to go into this first chapter. He said, he says, I thought it appropriate that I mention I begin with a chapter on the benefits of dhikr. Yeah, mutlaqan. Yeah, mutlaqan means just the general benefits of remembering God. أذكر فيه أطرافا يسيرة توطئة لما بعدها، ثم أذكر مقصود الكتاب في أبوابه، وأختم الكتاب إن شاء الله تعالى بباب الاستغفار تفاؤلا بأن يختم الله لنا به والله الموفق وبه الثقة وعليه التوكل والاعتماد وإليه التفويض والاستناد. He says, I begin with the mention, the benefits of dhikr. And he said just some associated kind of chapters with it. And he said, then I end the book, and then he said, then I cover the objective of this book, meaning he goes through chapter by chapter the various different types of Adhkar in pretty much every occasion you can imagine. He said, then I ended the book. He said, I end the book, inshallah, by the will of God, I will end this book with a chapter on istighfar. It's seeking refuge in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, asking for his forgiveness. Tafa'ulan bi an yakhtim Allahu lana. He said, in the hope, in the desire, in the wish that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, just the way I finish my book in a state of asking God, begging God for forgiveness, in the same way that when God takes us, when our lives end, he said, in the same way that may Allah, perhaps Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will make our ending, like this book's ending, maybe he'll make our ending in a state of istighfar, asking Allah for forgiveness. Wallahu al-muwaffiq wa bihi thiqa. He says that Allah is the one who gives all tawfiq, meaning ability. Tawfiq is ability, and wa bihi thiqa, and all reliance and trust is placed on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is thiqa, alayhi tawakkul wa i'timad, wa ilayhi tafweed. And he said, I put my all my affairs belong to God. And istinad, again, he said, I completely rely, totally submit on God. And the first bab then is babun mukhtasarun, or babu mukhtasar في أحرف مما جاء في فضل الذكر غير مقيد بوقت. He says the first chapter then, so see how he begins this text with, he makes reference to people he's benefited from. He very clearly outlines the strengths of this text and the purpose as to why he wrote it. He also touches on some of his own potential weaknesses. He talks about he lays out what the text is going to be like, and he gives us some insight as to why he laid out the text in that way. Ultimately, when these scholars wrote these texts, they weren't just writing them in the spur of the moment, and just thinking people will read them. It was for them a very serious thing to do, that they saw it as, this is my contribution. I've spent 20 years of my life studying, and now I'm going to eternalize that study so that people for potentially millennia benefit from these books. And when they do, I want to make sure that they actually do benefit, and that I don't cause more harm than benefit. Right. So this is something. It's a sense of intellectual responsibility that we have, that we make sure our books don't cause more harm than good. And I think this is something that's becoming more and more difficult to do, because it's I don't think the scholarly fraternity recognizes as a whole, we're not seeing our responsibility with the foresight that I think the historical scholars used to see it. And that's quite a generalization, and I don't think it's true for everybody. But there are certainly schools of thought out there that don't recognize that responsibility. It's very much in the moment. It's, writing a book about hijab and how women shouldn't have to wear it, writing a book about, this clothing should be, is not from the sunnah, and just writing a book about it as if that's, as if we're solving a problem for today, and we're not creating a problem potentially for the future. Or writing books about how Sahih Bukhari isn't as strong or as reliable as people thought. And these sorts of things once upon a time came from non-Muslims, and today we're getting Muslims that are writing on these topics. And it's one thing discussing it and speaking about it, although even that is probably not much different to writing it. If anything, it's probably more dangerous, because we're finding that YouTube is more accessible, and it's not like you can say something in a closed room and it disappears. I mean, it's eternalized in the internet ether. So there is a real responsibility that we have to have in terms of what we say and how we say it, and what the scholarly community does and says. And I think we can, as a whole, learn lessons from people like Imam Nawawi, who recognize that responsibility to such an extent that after years of study, he refused to consider himself a scholar. He called himself a talibul ilm, or a tawailib, which is not even a student. It's a young student and a child. It's on the ism tasghir for those of you who know Arabic. um, and then when he wrote these books, he was very clear about what exactly he was trying to do. He referenced the people that he benefited from. He didn't spend his introduction bashing people out there that he felt were not doing a good job, which is what you find these days. You can open up a book and actually spend 50 pages and just spent putting everybody else down. And it's this old saying in English: "Don't blow out my candle to make yours look brighter," which is very much something that we've embodied now. Which is, if I want to get ahead, if I want to excel or build my reputation, the way I do it is I just put somebody else's reputation down over there. So you find somebody who has reputation, and you take it away from them. That is the very definition of envy. Actually, envy is when jealousy, because jealousy is to desire something even if the cost is that somebody else lose it. Yeah. And actually, it's beyond that. It's where you'd rather they didn't have it. Yeah. You would rather that they lost it, and even if you couldn't gain it. And this is the kind of thing that we're finding more and more of, unfortunately, which is this sectarianism is ripe, and many of you would have experienced it or seen it with the masajid wars that happened over the last probably 15 years, or maybe even longer, but at least in my living memory, it's about 15 years or so, where these have been very, very strong. And sectarian thinking has been used to divide the Muslim ummah. And in fact, let's not even talk on a scale of the ummah. Let's talk about just the UK context, which is where the majority of us are. And I think the same is true for some other countries too. But here, there's these are agendas that are really, I think, blowing out other people's candles so that theirs look brighter. It's creating an identity for yourself, which is interestingly not. It's when you form an identity which is based on bashing somebody else, what you're actually doing is you become dependent on them. This is the interesting thing. If your entire reputation is about putting everybody else down, he's wrong, she's wrong, they're kafir, this person, the person of bid'ah, that group's of people of bid'ah, don't associate with them, what you're doing is you're basically creating this little island where you're the only person there, and you're saying, look, I'm Ahl Sunnah's inclusive, and yet what you've done is you've placed borders around every single group that's in any way successful. And what that means is that you've got your little island where you're kind of enclosed in, and you're hoping everybody else comes with you. The trouble with that thinking is that if your identity is based on the people that you're not, then you have no personal identity. Like, who are you? What do you actually stand for? Because all you do is you just tell us what you're not, right? So what are you offering? Now, because that's not thought through for some of these factions, because sometimes it's not very well thought through, it means they become extremely dependent, almost addicted to those groups around them, because the fear of them not being there, and that question, then what is my identity, comes to the fore, and they rather not face that. So it's much better that every now and again you need a good bashing session of some sect, whether it be a sect or not. Some difference, and it could be a subtlety in a wording. Someone wrote an article and there's one word that I didn't like, so I'm going to now spend the next 6 months of my life writing to them, putting stuff on Twitter, Facebook, and any other medium you can think of, and through it I'll gain some followers, and so on. This sort of mindset is, I'd say, antithetical to how the spirit of Islam in the old days. I'm not saying it didn't happen. I'm sure it probably did happen, and there were certainly scholars that differed, and those scholars had disputes among themselves. But I think that time and that age was different, in that in that time those disputes were left in the within that discourse, didn't really get out into the public. It wasn't like your dirty laundry was kind of thrown out into public. When you have things like YouTube that are accessible to everybody, and these sorts of mediums now, it all becomes completely accessible to anybody and everybody, which means people don't need context. They just need a powerful voice, somebody who's just willing to state their position and be willing to pay for a few more ads. um, as long as they become more vocal or more let's say apparent, then they take the people submit to that way of thinking. So there's the danger that actually people are given they hear half truths. They just hear the voice of the person that shouts the loudest, and they form their view of the deen on it. And some people would see beyond it. They just their nature, their disposition is such that they're not attracted to that sort of mindset, and they never follow it regardless of what you do. You can put them in a room of these sorts of people, and they'll never follow it because they're just not inclined that way. And there are others that are their nature is that they need that fire. They've got fire in their belly, and they need someone to not put it out but to ignite it even more, and they'll be attracted to it regardless of where it is. And then there's another group of people, which probably forms the majority of people, who really will follow whichever direction the sound's coming from. And that's the laity. That's the majority of us, that we just look, we don't have the not even the ability, it's the time, or the inclination to go and research and find a balanced view. So what we do is we take that one view that seems to be shouting the loudest. But those people have to take that responsibility, because we have to recognize that actually that's what people do. And therefore we have to balance our own views so that we're not putting people in that position. And what I like about people like Imam Nawawi is that I think he really recognizes that responsibility he has, in terms of the style in which he writes. He doesn't generally, his writing is that he doesn't put people down. And Imam Bukhari was very much that sort of person too. It's very particular about how he writes about people. They have husn al-dhan, and if you're going to say something about someone that you disagree with, you say it respectfully that you disagree. Then sometimes they'd mention the name, and you do find these things in certain books. Often they didn't, but sometimes they did. But it was very much intellectual. It was, look, this is what I disagree with them on. This is how they concluded their thing, and this is why I believe it's wrong. It's very much, it's left in the academic world for the scholars to decipher, not to create confusion amongst the masses. Anyway, so that's why I think for me the introduction is quite important, which is why I've spent some time going through it. It's because you really get an insight into the mindset of the author when you read it, and what's going through his mind. So hopefully those of you who have followed this throughout will appreciate kind of why it is that he wrote this book, and also you've been on this journey. Hopefully it felt like a journey, and now we're there now. So he begins with this the first chapter, as he promised, which is on the benefits of dhikr, and he mentioned a few verses. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-Ankabut, وَلَذِكْرُ اللَّهِ أَكْبَرُ, that the remembrance of God is certainly the greatest. The best thing that you can do, the best thing you can involve yourself in, is the remembrance of God. فَاذْكُرُونِي أَذْكُرْكُمْ, Allah says in Surah Al-Baqarah, remember me and I shall remember you. So the greatest thing that you can do is remember God. And God then on top of that says, and if you do remember me, if you do that thing, then if you remember me, then I will certainly remember you. فَلَوْلَا أَنَّهُ كَانَ مِنَ الْمُسَبِّحِينَ لَلَبِثَ فِي بَطْنِهِ إِلَى يَوْمِ يُبْعَثُونَ. And we have about Sayyidina Yunus in Surah Safat, that Allah says, had he have he said, had he have not been of the people, had he have not done the tasbih, because he was remembering God in the belly of the whale, had he have not been remembering God in the belly of the whale, he said he would have remained there until he was resurrected. Yeah. So the power of remembering God is that God alleviates your condition, whatever condition, plight that you might find yourself in. That's in Surah Safat. يُسَبِّحُونَ اللَّيْلَ وَالنَّهَارَ لَا يَفْتُرُونَ. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in recognizing the quality of these people who are people of paradise is they remember God day and night, tirelessly remember God without there ever being a break. And there's a in the Sahihain, the two Imams, Imam Bukhari, he says وفي روينا في صحيحي إمامي المحدثين أبي عبد الله محمد بن إسماعيل بن إبراهيم بن المغيرة البخاري الجعفي مولاهم، وأبي الحسين مسلم بن الحجاج بن مسلم القشيري النيسابوري رضي الله عنهما. He mentions the full names of these two illustrious scholars, Imam Muslim and Imam Bukhari, again out of respect for the people that he's narrating from. In the first time he mentions them, he says with their complete isnad, with the link all the way back to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and also his link back to them. Yeah, so he has a complete link back to both of these scholars. He said, "Ana Abi Hurairah radiyallahu anhu wa ismuhu Abdurrahman ibn Sakhr al-Asah min nahwi 30 qawlan wa huwa akthar sahabati hadithan." He says, and you relate from Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu, whose actual name was Abdurrahman. His actual name is Abdurrahman ibn Sakhr. He says, according to the soundest position, because there are about 30 opinions as to what Abu Hurairah's actual name was. Yeah. And for those of you who don't know, he was called Abu Hurairah. He was nicknamed that by the Prophet ﷺ. He loved that name and everyone called him by it, because once the Prophet ﷺ saw him, and he had in his sleeve, he had a kitten. Yeah, so he's playing with this kitten and he had it in his sleeve. And the Prophet said, Ya Aba Huraira. And a hirra in Arabic means cat. And Huraira is just like I mentioned earlier in Ism Tasghir. Yeah. Tuwaylib, Huraira, same scale, it means a small cat. In other words, kitten. So Abu Huraira became the father of kittens. And he kept that name from then on. That became his kunya, his nickname. And the Shaykh also tells us is he narrated the most amount of hadith amongst the Sahaba. So Abu Hurairah was a prolific hadith narrator, and there are accounts of he only spent about 2 to 3 years with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which is the great miracle here, because he spent 2 to 3 years with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. There were Sahaba that spent far longer, spent over 30, 40 years with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In some cases even longer than that, like Sayyidina Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu anh. So he spent such a small amount of time with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and yet he narrated the most amount of hadith. Yeah, over 4,000, over probably close to 5,000 hadith that he narrated, maybe even a bit more than that actually, that he narrated directly from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, to the point where the Sahaba used to tell him to slow down and not to narrate so much, just in case he make a mistake. And we know that he had he is in terms of Sayyidina Umar, when he was caliph, he was very firm on that. He was very firm about Sayyidina Abu Hurairah being careful about how much he narrated. But there's also a narration that Sayyidina Abu Hurairah, when he first started off, when he met the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he had a very weak memory, and he complained to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam about it. He said, I can't remember anything. And the Prophet then gave him some of his blessed saliva, and after that he said, I never forgot anything since. So part of this is the barakah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that just that one act meant that he went from not being able to remember anything to suddenly having a very good retention and narrating more hadith than any other sahabi. And he narrates this first narration, which this first hadith, which is kalimatan. So qala Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, kalimatan khafifatan ala al-lisan, thaqilatan fil mizan, habibatan ila ar-Rahman, subhanallahi wa bihamdihi, subhanallahi al-azim. Wa hadha al-hadith akhiru shay'in fi Sahih Bukhari. This hadith that he mentions is the first hadith he mentions. However, it's the very last hadith that Imam Bukhari radiallahu anh mentions in his Sahih Bukhari. Yeah, he opens with innamal a'malu bin niyat, and he ends with kalimatan khafifatan ala lisan. Yeah, so beginning with the hadith on intentions, and he ends with there are two words two kalimas that are light on the tongue, meaning easy to say, uh, thaqilatan fil mizan, but they are heavy on the scales. And heavy on the scales is means that they are in terms of your good deeds, it weighs heavily. Habibatan ila Rahman, and they are most beloved to the most merciful. What are they? Subhanallahi wa bihamdihi. The first is Subhanallahi wa bihamdihi, to recite Subhanallahi wa bihamdihi, and the second is Subhanallahi al-Azim. Subhanallahi al-Azim. So two utterances that are light on the tongue, easy to say, Subhanallah wa bihamdihi, Subhanallah al-Azim, easy to say, easy to retain, easy to remember, but as per Sahih Bukhari, but they are heavy on your scales. So this is probably the first thing that you can take away and start practicing this really simple hadith, implementing it. The last hadith in Sahih Bukhari, to recite Subhanallah wa bihamdihi, Subhanallah al-Azim. And there is and in the Sahih of Imam Muslim radiallahu an, Abu Dhar al-Ghifari radiallahu anhu قال لي رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم ألا أخبرك بأحب الكلام إلى الله تعالى إن أحب الكلام إلى الله سبحان الله وبحمده. وفي رواية سئل رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم أي الكلام أفضل قال ما استفى الله لملائكته أو لعباده سبحان الله وبحمده. In another hadith which is narrated through Abu Dhar al-Ghifari radiallahu anh, he says the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said to him, shall I not inform you of the most beloved of words to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Yeah. Now this is Sayyidina Abu Dhar al-Ghifari radiallahu anh. He was he's considered to be one of the earliest Muslims. He was either the fifth or the sixth person to enter Islam, between him and Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas. He was one of the earliest Muslims. He belonged to a tribe called the Ghifaris, yeah, the Banu Ghifar. And this tribe used to live on the outskirts of the city of near Medina. And what they were known for was that they were brigands. They used to be highwaymen, right? So they were known to be thieves. And so you didn't want to, they were like the mafia. You really didn't want to mess with somebody from the Ghifar, because the next time you head out on a caravan journey, they'd be waiting for you. Yeah, so they were renowned, they were quite famous, and people knew not to mess with them. But what happened was, they say Sayyidina Abu Dhar he always, from a very young age, he was a very quiet individual who liked to keep himself to himself, right? And this is Abu Dhar is I think a good example for us, in that there's a space for everyone in this religion. There's a place for everyone. Sayyidina Hassan bin Thabit is another example, and maybe we'll get onto a narration of his, inshallah, and we'll talk about him. And actually, that's one of the things that it'd be good to do, is to every now and again pick a Sahabi, and I'll just say a few words about them, inshallah, just so we learn a bit about them. And there's a number of Sahaba that I've mentioned here, so I'll just I'm on Abu Dhar, so I'll mention Abu Dhar, and maybe I'll pick one more, inshallah. Now, Sayyidina Hassan bin Thabit, for instance, was a poet, and he wasn't battle hardened. He wasn't a fighter. He was literally what you call a lover, not a fighter, because he would avoid battle. It just wasn't part of him. And the Prophet ﷺ built a minbar for him. He said, because your place is not in the battlefield, your place is to capture people's hearts with the words that you sing, and to protect the Prophet ﷺ through his words, yeah, and his reputation. That was the role that the Prophet ﷺ gave him. He saw the strength that he had, and he created a space for him, because everyone has a space in Islam. Abu Dhar is another very good example of this, because Sayyidina Abu Dhar radiallahu anh, from a very young age, is a very quiet individual. He liked a solitary life. He was never into, although everyone around him were they were groomed and nurtured to take over this role of terrorizing the tribes around them. He was never interested in that, and he always had this inclination towards believing in one God, or so they say. And when he heard that there was a man in Mecca that was calling to one God, um, he heard some rumors. He decided to go and find out for himself, and he went looking for the Prophet ﷺ, and he found some of the Sahaba, and they asked him, look, what is that you want? And he didn't tell them. And then they saw him the next day and the day after that, and eventually they said, look, just tell us and we'll help you. And he said, look, if I tell you who I'm looking for, then you've got to promise that you're not going to you're not going to go and tell the Quraysh. um, and he said, look, I'm looking for this man. And he described the Prophet ﷺ, the man who calls to one God. And eventually they pointed him to the direction of the Prophet ﷺ. And he went over to him and he saw that the Prophet ﷺ, this was in very early on, right? This is like literally in the first few months. Um, so they are secretly worshipping God. So what happens is the Abu Dhar sees the Prophet reciting something, and he says, what's this poetry that you're reciting? And the Prophet says to him, this isn't poetry, this is and then he tells him that this is the word of God. And Abu Dhar asks him about it, and he immediately does almost immediately, as soon as the Prophet tells him what he believes in, he says, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluhu wa ashhadu annaka rasulullah. He says to the Prophet, I bear witness that there is no God but Allah, and I bear witness that you are indeed his messenger. And the Prophet then said to him, said, where are you from? And he said, Ana min Bani Ghafar. Yeah, and he says, I'm from the people of Ghafar. He says, and the Prophet looked at him and smiled, because he knew who they were, he knew their reputation. And he said, what shall I do now? Abu Dhar said, what shall I do now? And the Prophet said to him, now go back to your people and wait for me. Yeah, wait for the signal that I give you. And Abu Dhar he was the kind of person that couldn't hold it. So although he's a very solitary person, he also he was very direct, in that if he saw something happening that he didn't agree with, he would he would be very forthright about it, and he'd just say it, to the point that it rubbed a lot of the people around him up the wrong way. Now he says, Ya Rasulullah, let me stay here with you, let me do something. And then what he did was he said, I can't leave until I've announced my faith. And he went and he shouted at the top of his lungs, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, that I bear witness that there's no God but Allah. And when the Quraysh saw, they thought this man had gone mad. They started, jumped on him and started hitting him, and attacking him, until Abbas sees it, the uncle of the Prophet ﷺ, and he sees it and he runs over, and the only way he stops them from beating him is they said, look, this man's from the Bani Ghafar. He said, if they find out what you did to him, they're coming for you. And that's when the Quraysh kind of stepped back and they thought, okay, let him go. And they left him. Now, so he leaves now. He's back to Medina. And years later, when the Muslims go back to, when they do the hijrah to Medina, there he is. And what has he done? The Prophet ﷺ made a dua for him. You see, when he was in Mecca, and he said, wait, go back to your people. The Prophet ﷺ looked at him and he said, Allahu yahdi man yasha. He looked at me and he was surprised, but also he had that smile on his face to say, almost to say, this is God's mysterious way of working, that even the Banu Ghifar have come here and they're looking for answers. And he said, Allah guides whom he wishes. And when they went to Medina, Sayyidina Abu Dhar al-Ghifari had already converted most of his tribe, that the Banu Ghifar, a lot of them become Muslim. And there was another tribe there too, and he'd managed to convert. They had converted to Islam. So there were already people that had submitted at the hand of and through the direction of Abu Dhar al-Ghifari, radiallahu an. So he was, I said he was a very solitary person. He was kind of he was very private, but he was also very firm and strict. He hated the dunya, everything about it. And he was renowned amongst the Sahaba for being like that, very aesthetic. Like he literally had nothing in his house. They say his house was completely bare bones. He lived with his wife, and somebody, it was Abu Bakr Siddiq, I think, that went to his house, and he looked inside, or Sayyidina Umar, in fact. He went to his house and he said, where's your furniture? And he said, look, this is not, this is the way I live. We're happy that way. And as he left, Sayyidina Umar looked to his wife and said, where's your furniture? How do you cook? And she said, this is Abu Dhar. And then Sayyidina Umar had to have a word with them to say, look, this might be you, but it's not. Don't force your asceticism on your wife Umzar, who was also a great sahabiya. um, that was his nature. He was very much, look, I live by this. This is the way I am. I don't want. There's a narration actually where somebody went to his house, and he said, what do you where's all your belongings? And he said, my belongings are in my palace. And he said, where's your palace? He said, in the hereafter with Allah. It's like he said, I send all my belongings there. That was just his nature. In the battle of Tabuk, what happened was, which was towards the end of the life of the Prophet ﷺ. So Battle of Tabuk was actually the last battle. It wasn't a battle, actually, it was an expedition. It wasn't a battle because there was no fighting that took place. It was in the last year, it was in the 9th year of the Hijrah. So it was the year before the Prophet ﷺ passed away. And during this, what had happened is the Prophet ﷺ received word that there were the Byzantines, or the Roman Empire. They were looking to advance and attack Madinah Munawwara and the Arabs. So the Prophet ﷺ rallied to try and get as much support as he can so he can go and face them. And many of the Quraysh people, they didn't step forward. But the Prophet ﷺ amassed an army of Muslims. But the trouble is, to get from Madinah Munawwara to go to Tabuk, which is where the battle took place, it's about 500 miles through scorching desert to hot desert, which means, first of all, getting there in the short space of time they need to get there was going to be a very difficult task. It was an arduous journey. There was a good chance that people would not make it, people would die, or people would just be too sick to carry on. So they wouldn't know how many Muslims they had eventually to be able to fight. And then even those who got there, imagine how weak they would be. Just imagine walking through, so if we're saying 500 miles, just imagine going through 500 miles of desert, yeah, on a camel. And if your camel doesn't make it, then you're on foot. Right? So most of them, they would have had these sorts of things. They've already been prepared for them. But a lot of the Muslims were really struggling physically. So some of them had to stop halfway, some of them less than that, some of them just couldn't leave because it was just too arduous a journey for them. And each time the same thing happened. As they stopped for a break, some of the Sahaba couldn't continue. They physically just were just not able to, and they had to turn back. And then eventually they got to their destination. Now, on the way, Sayyidina Abu Dhar was one of the people that went to this battle, to Tabuk. On the way, his camel became so weak that he got left behind. And he was struggling, urging this camel on. This great Sahabi of the Prophet, urging this Sahabi on, because he was not going to miss this for anything. He wanted to be by the side of the Prophet when he was, and he was going to do whatever it took. So he's urging this camel on, and eventually the camel just collapses and he can't do anything else. So what does Sayyidina Abu Dhar do? He grabs all of his stuff, he sticks it on his back, and he starts trekking through hundreds of miles of desert. And where nobody else made, the Sahaba that made it there, and the camels had made it there, and the Prophet was there, and they'd rested. And then people started saying, Sahaba were like, look, some of them are not going to be able to come. And they were telling the Prophet all, keeping him updated as to what's going on. And eventually, as days pass, somebody looks out into the distance, and they see just pure desert and that mirage sort of effect that you get, which is just the sand rising because of the heat. And what they see in the distance is a speck. And they say, there's somebody coming towards us. And the Prophet looks up at him and he said, Kun Abu Dhar. He said, be Abu Dhar. He looks at him and he knows it's Abu Dhar, because he knows the heart of Abu Dhar, that even if that camel died, Sayyidina Abu Dhar wasn't going to stop. He would come there, even if it meant he crawled there. And sure enough, that's exactly, none of the Sahaba could see at this time. They just saw a speck, but the Prophet saw with his piercing eyesight, and he's a complete faith and belief in the likes of Abu Dhar, that it was going to be him. And sure enough, it was Abu Dhar. And the Prophet looked at him, and he was so, he was out of he exclaimed in love and passion. He said, may Allah have mercy on our brother. May Allah have mercy on Abu Dhar. He lives alone. He will die alone. He'll be buried alone, and he'll be resurrected alone. Yeah, he will enter paradise alone. Beg your pardon. He'll enter paradise alone. Yeah, he will live alone. He will die alone. He will be buried alone, and he will enter the garden alone. And the reason why he said that was because he knew the nature of Abu Dhar, that he liked to just be left alone. He was just somebody who was solitary, and the Prophet knew his place. That was what he was like, and he then told the Sahaba, "This is his nature." Um, and as it turned out, Abu Dhar turns up. There he is, exhausted, but he makes it. Um, in later on during the caliphate of Sayyidina Uthman radiallahu an, Abu Dhar, he had requested it a few times before, but he said, "Look, I want to be left alone. People find it difficult because people are complaining about him too, because he was too direct. He would just tell people off, because he used to say, look, I can't bear, I can't bear um, falsehood around me. Anyone that says something that he thinks is not true, he would just openly, he would be very direct about it, and that sometimes it may have hurt people's feelings, but that was his nature. That was the nature of how he was. He just spoke up. He spoke truth to power, regardless of who it was. Um, and Uthman radiallahu anh gave him permission um, to go and live the solitary life that he always wanted, and that's what he did. So he went off to live in this solitary part in the desert, which is about 100 or so miles away from Medina to Munawwara. And he lives his life there to gets to an old age, and then radiallahu anh, he passes away. And the story goes that Ibn Mas'ud radiallahu anh narrates that what happened. There's different opinions as to how this happened, but Abu Dhar, when he was on his deathbed, as he was passing away, he was lying in the desert. It was just him and his wife and his child, and his wife was concerned that they had nothing. They literally had nothing. She said, and he said, "Why are you crying?" And she said, "I'm crying because I don't even have a cloth to cover you with." Um, and he said, "Why are you worrying?" And she said, "Because who's going to do this burial? How am I going to lift you? And how am I going to do all of this?" And so she was a pious woman. And he said, "No." He said, I heard the Prophet ﷺ once say that there would be one of us would die in the desert, and there would be a group of you will find him." And he said, the people around me, the Sahaba that were there at the time, all of them have passed away. He said, "I'm the only one left," so because therefore it must have been me. So as he passed away, some time later, a group of people arrive, and they see this sight of what seems to be somebody who had passed away, and he'd covered in a sheet, and a woman sitting there, and they ask who it is, and they said it was the companion of the Prophet Abu Zar radiallahu an, and it turns out it's Ibn Mas'ud, and it's Ibn Mas'ud radiallahu an, and they bury him, and and so what the Prophet had said came to pass, which is that he was found and he was buried, and he was buried alone. And to this day, there is a place now, the land where the desert where he is buried is it's about 100 or so miles away from, as I said, the northeast, the east of Medina Munawwara. Yeah, east of Medina Munawwara, where it's known as the land of the Abu Dhar, the resting place of Abu Dhar, where he's buried. So that was Abu Dhar, a very ascetic individual, and he narrates this hadith. قال لي رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. He said, the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم said to me, ألا أخبرك, he says, shall I not inform you, بأحب الكلام إلى الله, that the best of speeches to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He said, إن حب الكلام إلى الله. He said the best of speech to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is subhanallah wa bihamdihi, is to say subhanallah, to glorify Allah, wa bihamdihi, and his praise. So subhanallah means to Allah, exalted be God, wa bihamdihi, and exalted be his praise. Wa fi riwayah su'ila Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In one narration it says the Prophet was asked, ayyul kalam afdal, what is the best speech? And he said, qala, whatever Allah has chosen for his angels and for his or for his servants. And he said, subhanallah wa bihamdihi. Samura ibn Jundub, he narrates that ahabbul kalam ilallahi arba'un, there are four things that are beloved to Allah: to say subhanallah, to say alhamdulillah, to say la ilaha illallah, and to say Allahu Akbar. Yeah, and whichever one you read, the narration says whichever one you read, whichever one you begin with, it doesn't matter, they're all the same. La yadurruka bi ayyihinna badat. Yeah, you can start with any one of those. You can start with Alhamdulillah and read that 100 times, or read La ilaha illallah, or read Allahu Akbar, however many times you want. Yeah. So you find different litanies have different numbers. And if your particular teacher or sheikh tells you, look, read it an X amount of times, then by all means do. Otherwise, there isn't really a specified amount. Yeah. There isn't a specified amount. So whatever you're comfortable with, you can start with doing 10, do 5 or 10 in a day. If you never do any, then just 5 or 10 a day. Just pick a time and just start reading it, and don't even maybe be specific about timing initially. Just do it each of these 10 times, or do it once or twice or whatever. Just build up to it slowly. The Prophet ﷺ said in a narration by Abu Malik al-Ash'ari, he said, "At-tuhuru shatr al-iman, walhamdulillahi tamla'u al-mizan, wa subhanallahi walhamdulillahi tamla'ani, aw tamla'u ma bayna as-samawati wal-ard." That purification is a part of faith. So it begins with purification is a part of faith. And then it says, and the praise of God fills the scale, al-mizan, and subhanallah and alhamdulillah, they fill what is between the earth and the heavens. Yeah, in other words, it's almost as if to say they fill everything in between. Yeah, to fill everything in between. It's interesting how tahara, which is purity, is mentioned. And one way of looking at this is you've got both the physical and the spiritual purification. So by mentioning physical purification, which we can relate to, what we're being directed to is actually the spiritual purification, to say, just the way you cleanse yourself by cleaning yourself physically, in the same way, if you want to clean your spiritual heart, then this is the recipe. This is how you do it. The water that cleanses your spiritual heart is to say Subhanallah walhamdulillah, to say these two formulations. وروينا فيه أيضا أن جويرية أم المؤمنين رضي الله عنها أن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم خرج من عندها بكرة حين صلى الصبح، وهي في مسجدها، ثم رجع بعد أن أضحى وهي جالسة فيه، فقال سيدة جويرية radiallahu anha, who is the mother of the believers, she is one of the wives of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Juwayriya. Her father originally, the tribe that she comes from, they had initiated a battle with the Muslims, and when the Muslims fought against them, the Muslims defeated them, and some of their people were captured. Yeah, her name is Juwayriya bint Harith. Harith was the father's name, if I remember correctly. Her father's name was Al Harith. He was the leader of their tribe, and they were captured. And as was the custom of that time, the way they did things is that the distribution amongst the people who fought in that battle would be, they would get all the goods from, so the armor, etc., and also if there's any captives, that they would be distributed as slaves. Yeah. But the kind of slaves they were was that they could buy back their freedom. Yeah, they had the option to buy back their freedom. Now what happened was, Juwayriya was given to one of the Sahaba, who I want to say it's Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, but I could be wrong. Anyway, she was given to one Sahaba. And the thing with Juwayriya was she was brought up as the daughter of a chieftain, which meant she had the luxury lifestyle. Right, she was used to having a luxury lifestyle. And then she comes into this land, and she's now captured, and she's within a household where they have barely make ends meet. So she goes to the Prophet ﷺ and she says, look, you've brought me to this land, and you've captured us, but you're supposed, I've heard things about you. You're a prophet of his people, and I come from a place of luxury and a lifestyle of luxury, and this man that you've given me to, he can't maintain me. He can't give me my rights. Now, what's interesting about that is that this is somebody who's supposed to be a slave. She's been captured, and yet she's being heard, and her expectations are not seen as ridiculous. They're seen as valid, as in that's the lifestyle she was accustomed to, and we have to respect that lifestyle. So there's really something in there for us to reflect on, that people are, we shouldn't blame people for the lifestyle they're accustomed to, or the lifestyle they grew up with. You know, so we shouldn't look down on somebody who's been brought up in a very wealthy family, as if they had a choice in it, as if to say that it's their fault that they haven't shunned that lifestyle. Well, why would they? Let's be honest, if we had that wealth, we would probably be the same. Yeah. So to judge them based on a lifestyle that they had no choice in is unfair. Yeah. That's not to say that you don't help somebody who is probably finding it difficult to recognize some of the flaws that come with wealth. It's not to say that that isn't a responsibility if you truly are a friend, but it's not. But we shouldn't judge them or make them feel lesser than, or make somebody with money feel like they shouldn't have money. I've spoken to, I've had people in the past call me, and I've got friends that do call me, and have this battle sometimes, who are quite, they are reasonably wealthy in the sense that they're well off, they're comfortable, they're not worried about putting food on the table. But every now and again, I've got a couple of friends that come to mind now that will call me and say, look, I heard this and it made me feel like, that I'm doing something wrong. Yeah. So things like, they'll get a text message from somebody they know saying that, look, you should give zakat to such and such place, we should give sadaqah. And he sees it as, I've got money, and therefore they're just targeting me, and they're making me feel like if I don't give it, I'm somehow not utilizing my wealth like I should. And the kind of the passive aggressive aspect of that, or at least that's how he reads it, or people would read it, is that somehow I'm not giving money, or that I'm somehow misusing that money, or I'm hoarding that money. That's some of the implications that are subtly infused in that sort of mind, that sort of thinking, or that could be the perception, and that's really problematic, because just because somebody has that money, they're no more. We have a responsibility, but at the same time, we shouldn't make somebody feel that way. And one of the things that I say to people that I know that have alhamdulillah well off, is if they ever ask me for advice, is first thing I say is keep your money to yourself, and don't give it to people who ask for it. You decide, and you think about who needs it most, and give it in accordance to what you think. Do it in the private of your own space, in the privacy of your own household, and do it yourself. Don't give it, or don't donate it because somebody's almost emotionally blackmailed you into giving money. And the reason why I say that to them is that there's nothing worse than resentment. If you feel resentment towards somebody who made you do that, and it may not happen straight away, it may happen in 10 years time, that's not a good thing. No money in the world will replace that. So it's best just not to get into that, and to make your own judgment as to what's appropriate and what's not appropriate, and who to give your money to, and who not to give your money to. So there's these sorts of things are unfortunately quite prevalent, that I've experienced myself. I've seen people and organizations do this, and I don't it happens unwittingly, and perhaps it's just me being overly critical. But just as a piece of advice, that if somebody has if Allah has given you wealth, then use it appropriately. Don't hoard it. Don't just store it for a life that you may not have, or for a generation that may not come. Don't hoard it, but at the same time, don't be emotionally blackmailed into dishing it out, because you've earned that money, so you should now use it appropriately. You apply the same business acumen to how you donate your money as you did to accumulate your money. Now, say that Juwayriya was brought up in a household where she was quite accustomed to that lifestyle. So when the Prophet, when she came to the Prophet and she made this plea, the Prophet offered. He said, "Look, if you don't want that lifestyle," he said, "would you consider marrying me? And if you marry me," he said, "you're free, and I'll pay off the ransom that you owed. Right? I'll pay all of that off if you want." And she jumped at the chance, because he was a man who was the head of his people. And they had, regardless of what people may have thought of the Muslims, they had immense respect for the Prophet. You know, even those who considered him he's their enemy, they respected his honesty and his integrity, because he's a man of integrity. And for her, that was, she absolutely accepted it. So she married the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And actually, what happened was a lot of their tribe became Muslims because of that, because they saw how the Prophet treated her and how they treated the people. In fact, the Prophet even freed all the family members, and the tribe was freed. Actually, her tribe was freed because technically now they were relatives. They were cousins, through marriage, through musahara. So they were freed. So that was Juwayriya, very very aesthetic, again a bit like Abu Dhar, very aesthetic in how she was. And she narrates this, that she was reciting and she was doing some dhikr. So خرج من عندها, the Prophet left one morning, حين صلى الصبح, after he had, when he left, when he prayed Fajr. Here في مسجدها, she was in her masjid. Her masjid here means in her room. Yeah, في مسجدها was used in hadith and used in to mean for women. Their masjid was the part of the house that they designated as the place where they would pray. Yeah, that's called fi masjidiha, meaning fi, if in the hujra, or there are other terms that are used for this, but generally means the place that's designated for prayer. And that's we should all try and have that in our households. Have some part of the house which is a designated place for the prayer. It really does change your kind of your it will change the way you to be honest, it'll change the way you pray. It's actually really powerful. I've deliberately made a small area now in the house. So we have a place where we normally pray, but I've actually built something which resembles like the masjid windows, and it makes such an amazing difference in terms of how I even approach my prayer. In that I'll go into that area, and it's almost, even though it's all visible on the inside and there's no windows as such, but even so, it feels like I'm enclosed. I'm in my own private space. There's a place, a janamaz, a musalla there that I can pray on. There's some sibhas, there's tasbihs there. So if you almost you want to do it, and I think part of that's just missing the masjid. But there's a real desire that comes out of just creating a space, and I think we can all relate to it, hopefully, because let's leave a masjid for a second and just think about your own room. How different do you feel when you just clean your room? Right? When you clean your room, it just changes everything. Everything just feels really cluttered and messy, and just feels so you feel hot and bothered, and just feel like just everything, that the day doesn't seem right. And then all of a sudden you open a window, or you vacuum your room, and the whole thing is just transformed. Your mindset's transformed. And that's what it does when you create a small space in your house that's a masjid. It transforms your mindset. It's a really easy, nifty way of just forming a connection in your prayer, or separating yourself away from the dunya, as in moving away from it's like it's the best way to form an intention, because the purpose and intention has for the prayer is that what it does is, it's a moment where you close your eyes and you exclude everything else, and you direct yourself towards God. Yeah. But when we get into a habit of doing that, it just becomes a formula that we do, but we don't embody what the intention brings. By creating a small space in your house, it does that for you, because as you walk in, you immediately physically separate yourself from the world, and then you psychologically separate yourself from it too. It's so much easier. And then once you do that, then suddenly things become, the act of ibadah just becomes more enjoyable, or you want to do more of it because you're in your little space. So I can't recommend enough for people to do something like that if you haven't already. So she's in her masjid. ثم رجع بعد أن أضحى, and then he sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he returned after he read the duha prayer, after the sun had come up, basically. وهي جالسة فيها, and she was still sitting in the same place in her area in the masjid. فقال, and he sallallahu alaihi wasallam said to her, ما زلت اليوم على الحالة التي فارقتك عليها. He said, have you been in the same place you were there when I left you? Meaning, have you not moved at all since I left? Yes, it gives you an insight into how Sayyidah Juwayriya was, that she was just sat there and she was just doing azkar. قالت نعم, she said yes. The Prophet ﷺ said to her, لقد قلت بعدك 4 كلمات 3 مرات لو وزنت بما قلت منذ اليوم لوزنتهن. He said, let me tell you 4 very simple formulas, 4 simple statements that you recite 3 times. He said that if you were to weigh everything that you've done from the moment I left to the moment I returned, that whole time, so which would have been what, an hour? Let's say an hour. Everything you've done in that hour, that if you were to weigh that on the scale with what I'm about to teach you, that this will be weightier on the scale. And the Prophet said to her, Subhanallahi wa bihamdihi adada khalqihi wa rida nafsihi wa zinata arshihi wa midada kalimatih. He said, Subhanallahi wa bihamdihi, that glory be to Allah and glory and praise be to Him. Adada khalqihi, the amount of His creation. So the words you use are adada khalqihi, the amount of the creator. Wa rida nafsihi, and the amount that will give would please God. وَزِنَةَ عَرْشِهِ, and that's weighty on his, that weighs the equivalent of his arsh, yeah, weighs his arsh. وَمِدَادَ كَلِمَاتِهِ, and it's you know, it's weighted heavily, just say weighted heavily, the amount that you know, amount of uh, all of creation, right? It's weighted beyond everything in creation. Just that one formula. He, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, is saying that just by saying that one formula, what you've done is you've taken that 1 hour and you've condensed it into what? Into about 30 seconds. But that 30 seconds is more heavy on the scales than all of that time. That's something really we should reflect on. I'm going to stop there, inshallah, because what you've got is somebody's doing a lot of ibadah, and the Prophet ﷺ is teaching her that you can get a lot of value, the equal amount of value, if not greater value, by doing it in a very short space of time, where you are completely focused. It's a lesson for us, where you're completely focused. And in 30 seconds, you can maximize your efficiency by getting as much reward as if you had done it for the whole hour. Yeah, that for me is an indication as to how we should approach dhikr. We shouldn't be going for quantity, we should be going for quality, and we should be going for efficiency, which is what do we say which gives us the maximum amount of reward, and how do we make it as easy as possible for me? Because this the other thing in here is the Prophet ﷺ took something that's quite heavy and difficult for a lot of people to do, um, and taught a formula which becomes accessible to everybody, right? Because now we don't have to do all of that dhikr to match up to the rewards of Sayyidah Juwayriyah here, because the Prophet doesn't said to us that, look, you can do this, you don't have to do an hour's worth of ibadah, you can do it in 30 seconds if you really pay heed to what I'm telling you. But do that for an hour and suddenly you've multiplied it exponentially. Inshallah, we will stop there. We'll finish this section for next week, inshallah, and begin the next section. We'll call it a day. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.